Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society for this afternoon's webinar, How to Save a Circus Poster, which is the first of our virtual programs for 2022. We're joining you this afternoon from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain a vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Interim Vice President for Programs at the Society. The American Antiquarian Society is a national research library and a learned society in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials printed or produced before 1900 in what is now the United States, in portions of Canada, and in the Caribbean. Our collections include newspapers, books, manuscripts, children's literature, and graphic arts materials. We support and welcome scholars and readers from around the country and indeed around the world to our reading room or to seek out materials on our website. We also offer regular programming like today's virtual program. And I invite you to return to us to join us for upcoming programming in the coming weeks and months. We have a great series of programs lined up for 2022, and you can go to our website for continual updates on programs for a series of programs related to women's history, Indigenous insights, nature and the environment, artists in the archive, and a book talk series, again this year, hosted by our program in the history of the book in American culture, and more programs like the one you're about to see this afternoon, providing multiple perspectives on a collections object, which is hosted today by the Society's Center for Historic American Visual Culture, or CHAVIC, which was established at the Society to promote the use of visual culture for research and teaching. You can learn more about the center and all of the programs at AAS by looking at our website, and there will be links for that in the chat. We thank you for joining us today, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome your support as our friends to help provide and help keep this work going. I'm joined today by my colleague, Kayla Hopper, Director of Outreach, who will introduce today's presenters and will also share with you some of the logistics about the format for our program. Enjoy the program. Kayla, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, thanks, Nan, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's program. I'm going to start with some technology information and talk a little bit about the schedule for today's program. So it will feature brief presentations from our three panelists, who I will introduce in just a minute. After their presentations, we'll conduct a brief discussion, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. Although we will take questions for the presenters at the end of the program, please feel free to post your questions at any time. Please post these questions in the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. By using the Q&A function, we're able to keep track of questions better, and it has an upvote function. So if someone posts a question you really want to see discussed, be sure to upvote it and help get it to the top of the queue. We will be using the chat box throughout the program for informational purposes. We'll share relevant links and information there, and you can contact us as presenters if there's any technical difficulties that we should know about. If you want to save the chat to retain the links for future use, you can save a transcription by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. Finally, we are recording this program and we'll make it available on our website and YouTube channel for viewing later. Now for today's program. The item featured in today's program is one of those special collection stories that we all love to tell. Lauren Hewes, AAS's Curator of Graphic Arts and Vice President for Collections, purchased the Circus poster in 2018. The dealer had been offered the poster fragments, which had been found in the attic of a former tavern in Maine. But given that it was crumpled and torn and in a jumble, he wasn't sure if AAS would be interested. After Lauren recognized the work of printer Jared W. Bell of New York. Knowing his significance, which she'll talk about later in the program, she purchased the remnants and brought them back to AAS to show Babette Gehnrich, AAS's chief conservator. While Lauren may have been worried about Babette's reaction, given the condition of the object, Babette was ready and willing to take on the job. She saw it as a perfect conservation challenge and one that was made particularly timely by the imminent opening of AAS's new conservation lab, which Babette will be joining us from today. So we'll see a little bit of that. In the end, about 80% of the poster has been conserved. In today's program, Babette and Lauren will discuss details of the conservation work, as well as the broader work of printer Jared Bell. Joining Lauren and Babette is Matthew Wittmann, curator of the Harvard Theater Collection at the Houghton Library. Matthew, you can turn on your video and audio, and he will be kicking off the program by placing the poster in its entertainment and advertising context. So I'm going to step out, and we'll get your slides up in just a second, and you can take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. I want to first thank the American Antiquarian Society for the invitation to speak today. Likely, but hopefully not the most boring section of this presentation before we get to the exciting conservation work that's been done. In case I'm interrupted, I just want to make clear my situation here in Somerville, namely that I'm trapped in a house with a toddler. I've literally moved a dresser in front of a door, and we'll see how it goes, but there might be some interruption. So apologies for that. And then the last caveat on kind of a similar COVID front is simply that Harvard Library has us working from home at the moment. And so not all my slides are as nice as I would have liked to have them. But in any case, my goal today is just to provide context for this poster with a discussion of the traveling menagerie in the United States to 1835. So if we could go to the first slide, please. This first slide is of an exhibition I curated at the Bard Graduate Center in 2012. Front and center at that exhibition was a poster very like the one we are discussing today. It was also printed by Jared Bell in 1835, and the American Antiquarian Society has a copy of it, but this one we see here is from the Shelburne Museum. I just thought looking at screens and slides, it's hard to get perspective, and so I hope in some small way this provides some. It's spectacular, it's enormous. And I don't know. I think we can forget how wondrous and novel these things were for contemporary observers. And to that end, I wanted to quote David Wilkie, who was a Scottish traveler in the United States in 1834. And he remarks in a bit where he's discussing about going back to a coffee house. This is in New York in 1834. He describes, quote, perusing the contents of a huge bill in the bar room, which being too long to stretch its length between the ceiling and the floor, had been separated in the middle and the pieces placed side by side. It embodied an excellent specimen of Yankee puffing. Portraits of every ill-shaped brute which the caravan contained were displayed, with descriptions below each of the most wonder-working sort. In the eyes of many a juvenile observer, the very bill, which hung in all its palpable length before them, afforded good proof of the truth of what was stated, for it was impossible, they thought, that there were not such animals to be seen, when their very portraits were grinning in fearful liveliness from the paper before them, and even seemed to be bellowing forth a confirmation of what was written below. He ends by saying that no nation in the world understands the science of puffing more profoundly than the American, or practices it to more advantage. So, at any rate, a short introduction to how one contemporary observer saw this poster and what one of them looked like in its full glory. So I'm going to try and not step on Lauren's toes, but because much of what we know about the traveling menagerie business comes from its advertising, a lot of my slides, will reflect that. In any case, we can proceed to the next slide. Itinerant displays of animals had a long history in colonial America, but they're also very difficult to track. More often than not, it was just single animals or small groups. On the right, I've put in some rough dates for the arrival of various species. Much of this is debated because it's hard to know what exactly the animals were in some cases. They were not always advertised correctly, or I guess honestly, you would say. The long and the short of it is that tavern keepers, sea captains, itinerant showmen were displaying exotic species throughout the 18th century. For an excellent look at this early show culture, I encourage you to check out Peter Urbena's book, For a Short Time Only, which has a whole chapter dedicated to these displays and the impact of images in advertising, including a lot of images from the American Antiquarian Society. What's really important is really that the pace of this activity picks up at the turn of the 19th century, with a notable and singular event being the arrival of the first elephant in 1796. I just actually learned the other day that this elephant that arrived in 1796 was actually at Harvard's commencement in 1797. Commencements were kind of gathering places for show people, and so they brought it to Cambridge Common in 1797. In any case, we're less concerned about these individual displays than menageries, which properly concerned is a larger collection or aggregation of animals. And we can debate about exactly where that is, but in order to further try and demarcate this territory, we'll go to the next slide. This slide has two more cultural forms to which the traveling menagerie at the turn of the 19th century was related, but also distinct from: circuses and museums. These are two contemporaneous broadsides from the Harvard Theater Collection. On the left is John Bill Ricketts, who in 1793 opened a circus in Philadelphia and then traveled up and down the eastern seaboard. And then on the right, so I should say that Ricketts, the circus at this point is largely an equestrian entertainment. There's acrobats, there's horses, but not, at least in its early stages, wild animals. On the right is a broadside for the Columbian Museum, with the opening of the American Museum in New York City, Peale's in Philadelphia, and the Columbian Museum in Boston. You had urban institutions that offered a combination of things like waxworks, paintings, automatons, taxidermy, and in some cases, live animals. This broadside shows a badger and a porcupine, and at the very bottom, it indicates that the museum has an eagle, a raccoon, and a baboon. And it notes that they are, quote unquote, well secured in wire cages. As we'll see, escape of animals was certainly an issue for the business. And then the next slide, please. Two of the more knowledgeable scholars on this subject, Stuart Thayer and Richard Flint, used 1813 as the start of the traveling menagerie business. Again, there's this kind of hazy line where you think you get to a group of traveling animals. In this case, the Museum of Living Animals, as it was called, was tutoring the mid-Atlantic states with a tiger, monkeys, and some other animals. And so generally, we credit that as the first kind of touring, traveling menagerie. What's remarkable is how quickly the business expands. By the poster you see here in 1818 in Boston, there's a tiger, there are llamas. As you can see, I've blown up a detail from the broadside that shows a monkey riding the llama. So they've taught it some tricks, but I just love the look on his face or her face. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the circus and menagerie, I said, were quite different entities at this point, and a lot of that depended on the reception by their audiences. And so here I've just juxtaposed something that makes that clear to quickly illustrate the point. On the left is an excerpt from a Worcester newspaper, the Massachusetts Spy from 1832. This piece was published after a circus had visited the town. It decries the fooleries of the circus, which it says, quote, encourages idleness, cruelty, and vice. To be fair, the image on the right is from a pamphlet that was printed also by Jared Bell in 1835 for the Zoological Institute. This is something they sold at shows, but it's so in a sense, it's their self-presentation, but it's very much in the elevating educational scientific vein. They say they are, quote, elevating and placing upon a permanent basis the science of natural history. And they go on to talk about the pure and legitimate stimulant of human reflection that understanding and gazing on these animals will provide. Conservative efforts to make menageries respectable in a way the circus was not at this point able to do, usually by wrapping them in scientific and biblical context, was very common in. Menageries were simply able to succeed in ways that circuses were not. Of course, these divisions and distinctions are not hard and fast, and they began to break down amid the flowering of American popular culture in the 1820s. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So with the expansion of popular entertainment in the 1820s, we see this in a variety of fields. In the theater, Edwin Forrest, the Bowery Park and Tremont Theater open or expand. In the literary world, James Fenimore Cooper is a bestseller, et cetera. We can go on and on. This is reflected also in the show culture that we see with the menageries. By 1825, there were a dozen menageries on tour. The typical pattern was that they would hole up for the winter in an urban center and then spend during the winter and then spend the spring, summer, and fall touring, traveling upwards of 2,000 miles in a season. All of this was done in an effort to capitalize on a growing American market for entertainment. It was also becoming increasingly geographically dispersed by westward expansion. This move to mobility by the menagerie was echoed in the circus, which after 1825 most circuses began to adopt canvas tents. In 1828, in what was then a first, a menagerie owned by Charles Wright and Benjamin Brown Circus toured together through Virginia and the Carolinas. So there's a certain logic that starts to push the menagerie and the circus together, whatever the cultural and economic divides are. This trunk from the New York State Museum is to be an object representative of this mobility and the gradual confluence of the circus and menagerie businesses. It is lined with a broadside for a circus in Troy, New York, and shows the elephant Columbus, who we will see again, tossing his trainer in the air. This kind of wild animal act in a circus was uncommon at the time, but there's clearly value in its novelty, and it suggests something of what's to come. Next slide, please. Looking at it from the other direction, one way that the menagerie found to borrow from the circus without bringing some of its baggage was simply to train animals to do circus acts. The images here is from the conserved poster at American Antiquarian Society. It shows what's called a dandy jack act, which basically is a monkey riding a pony. We saw earlier a monkey riding a llama, so I guess there was a huge variety of these they could do. It's overlaid with a wonderful thing from the Benjamin Brown papers at the William Clements Library. I mentioned him before. Brown was a circus and menagerie owner who goes to Africa in the late 1830s to get giraffes, or as they were then known, camel leopards, a much better name, I think, for the circus. At any rate, it's a jacket worn by a monkey in his papers. So slide, please. The biggest innovation in terms of menageries in the 1820s, one, a kind of performative thing that suggests some competition from the circus, was that from 1829 forward, menageries usually carried some form of the phrase, "the keeper will enter the cage." So in 1829, Charles Wright who's a menagerie owner, starts to feed and play with the animals. So he'll go into the cage with a lion, feed it, kind of toy around with it to add some novelty to what were then fairly static displays. I picked this dramatic image to try and break up all the advertising of broadsides. It's a painting by Edmund Landseer of the great American animal trainer Isaac Van Amberg. He's going to come up in this generation of 1830s animal trainers. Again, it starts as something very mild. He's doing a kind of more involved animal training act with these seemingly very scared lions. And it goes to London in the late 1830s. In any case, the next slide, please. This was obviously a very dangerous business. This lithograph depicts an incident at the Bowery Menagerie when an escaped leopard kills another one of the animals and is going after a keeper who is then dramatically rescued by an elephant. Not everyone was so lucky. In 1833, near New Haven, a keeper named Roberts was torn to pieces by two tigers in front of a horrified audience. In any case, it's not the only disaster, as you might imagine, that afflicted these, both for the people and the animals. Next slide, please. The traveling menagerie business reaches its peak in the 1830s. This broadside was recently acquired from the collection of the late, great Ricky Jay. It's a useful illustration of what the business looks like in the early 1830s. How much it's expanded both in terms of the number of menageries traveling and the range of animals. The first rhinoceros arrives in the United States in 1830. Americans had sort of been passively purchasing animals through British and German colonial networks, but in the mid-1830s, they start to mount expeditions to go to Africa to retrieve animals directly. I just love the goofy look on this tiger's face. And I just wanted to highlight two other little bits on that thing. The first is the quote, "the living animals" part, which is important because so many displays at museums were taxidermied animals. They're drawing a distinction here that these animals are alive. One of the troubling things that you'll see if you read about people that visited traveling menageries, though, is that not all the animals were in fact alive, because if you had spent $1,000 getting a tapir from South America and it died, you just taxidermied it and you kept toying around in the cage. The other thing I just wanted to highlight, this is a smaller kind of, not necessarily a handbill, but a smaller side printed size. It references the fact that there are larger bills that will have, presumably more images and more description of the things that are in the exhibit, which presages the combination of the things that will culminate in 1835, as we'll see. Next slide, please. And so we arrive at the belle of the ball, this wonderful poster for the James and William Howes Menagerie. There is an 1834 inventory in the Somers Historical Society for this show, which doesn't exactly match what's on the poster, but gives us an idea of how big of a business this was. It lists the various animals that are priced anywhere from $15 to $3,000, 15 cage wagons, a band wagon, a concession wagon, and 50 horses. It ascribes them the value of $46,000. That's likely inflated, but even in then, you get the sense of how big of a business this is by the mid 1830s. And that large of an investment requires significant returns. And one way to maximize those was advertising like this. So as Lauren, I'm sure will address, in 1835, a group of showmen get together and create what's called the Zoological Institute or Association. It's capitalized with over $1 million. They managed 13 menageries that season and commissioned Jared Bell to do their advertising. Unfortunately, this peak was a very short one, as the Panic of 1837 had a devastating impact on the menagerie business. People were just not willing to pay the prices they had been to see the animals. And that drove menageries into combine with circuses. Eventually, the educational mantle of menageries is taken over by zoological parks. Wild animals are integrated into the ring, and the menagerie, in a sense, becomes an auxiliary attraction to the circus. Still, the traveling menagerie had played an important role in legitimizing popular entertainment and provided a model of sorts for the circus to absorb as it ascended to the forefront of American culture. There's so much that I'm not able to touch upon here, everything from the relationship between colonialism and animal exhibitions to the origins of the American welfare movement. But I think that just underscores the important work that the American Antiquarian Society did in rescuing this wonderfully rich source from, I guess, the tavern attic of history, and how we can look forward to the varied ways that scholars will make use of it in the years to come. And with that, I'm going to close my remarks. Kayla is going to post something in the chat that links to some of the things I talked about, which might be of interest to you all. And I will now turn things over to Babette Gehnrich.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I hope. I am Babette Gehnrich, Chief Conservator at AAS. And I am going to tell, excuse me, is everything okay with the audio? I hope so.
You're good, Babette. Go ahead.
Okay, I am Babette Gehnrich, Chief Conservator at AAS, and I am going to tell you about the reconstruction of this remarkable paper object. Next slide, please. I vividly recall the day curator of graphic arts, Lauren Hewes, stepped into the conservation lab, pushing a cart carrying an old trunk. The trunk contained what looked like a hopeless pile of printed paper bits, large and small. She cautiously inquired whether I thought it might be feasible to attempt making sense of the box's content. Conservators being problem solvers by nature, I was rather intrigued by the challenge and replied with a perhaps prematurely upbeat, "Of course." With conservation on board, Lauren Hewes, who recognized that the fragments were likely parts of an important early circus poster printed by Jared Bell, instructed us to go ahead with the treatment. She knew this would be the only way to safely access its rich content, both the illustrations and the printed text. As it was clear then that a large space would be needed, we decided to hold off on the project until the opening of the newly constructed conservation lab, scheduled for July 2019. So I began the project a year later, once we were settled in the new lab, in the summer of 2020, with the help of summer intern Abigail Slawick, then a first-year student at NYU's graduate conservation program. Next slide. Here we are. Not knowing anything at that point about the shape and size of the object, and whether in fact all pieces belong to the same one item, the first step was to untangle and unfold all fragments as best as possible, and spread them out on a large surface. Doing so revealed that we were indeed dealing with mostly one object. There was also a small, very fragmented yellow broadside inside that was also treated by the intern during the summer. So with this particular object, the losses were estimated to be around 50 to 60%. So given this incomplete state, we had to ask ourselves whether it was worth proceeding with what was clearly going to be a time-intensive treatment. So Lauren Hewes was consulted once again, but she reconfirmed the object's significance and that its stabilization would be essential in making the content accessible to scholars. So we carried on. What emerged from the old trunk was 6 large landscape format segments of roughly the same size, about 2 by 3 feet, and 1 larger horizontal section. And you can see 4 of these 8 pieces right here on the screen. Where was I? Miraculously, the large horizontal strip had survived with partially intact left-right borders, and that conclusively established the width of the object at 72 inches or 6 feet. In addition, approximately 100 small to medium-sized fragments were recovered, most of them loose, but others stuck to larger sections. As shown in the previous slide, each fragment, even the tiniest piece, was carefully documented through photography and by recording its location as found. Also among the fragments were a dozen multi-layered bundles, which I knew were going to be difficult to delaminate, given the weakness of the paper in some areas. The individual letterpress and woodblock printed sheets appeared to have been pre-assembled with hide glue at Bell's print shop, and the 6 by 8 foot poster was then simply tacked to the building's exterior and not glued down as one might have expected. This was evidenced by the tack holes found throughout, and some had rusty edges, so we knew that there were metal tacks, and also the lack of adhesive on the verso. And some of those images you'll find in Abby's blog post. She photographed those little tack holes. This method of mounting is what initially preserved the poster. The real damage occurred later during storage, likely in a basement or attic, where the poster was presumably left unattended, folded, then rolled up for safekeeping. Over time, water caused severe tide lines. Damp conditions facilitated mold growth, but perhaps worst of all, rodents were allowed to nibble away at the paper. And if you look closely, well, you can't, I think I didn't select the right item, but on one of the later images, you'll see the little bite marks along the edges of the tear-shaped losses. Each of the large sections required thorough dry cleaning to remove the extensive surface dirt. Conservators typically use vinyl eraser crumbs for this purpose, and you can see that here. The crumbs are gently rubbed over the paper, either by hand or with sponges and brushes. This took a good amount of time, as you can imagine, due to the fragility of the object. And so sometimes in the process, another little piece would come loose, and then we would have to document that again. And so we have hundreds of photographs of all these little fragments. Next slide, please. Once surface cleaned, the individual sections were then humidified and blotter washed. This was done to relax the paper, reduce tide lines and overall staining, minimize creases, and also remove any adhered, disassociated fragments from front and back. And you can see the process here. And so at the bottom right is an image of the stain getting pulled into the absorbent fabric below through capillary action. And this is always very satisfying to watch when the stain just completely leaches out. Where the paper was still strong, multiple layered bundles could be carefully separated by peeling away each layer through controlled wetting and transferred to polyester film. This often revealed wonderful previously obstructed content. Where paper was too weak and separation impossible without causing further damage, bundles were left as is and fragments digitally incorporated later on. And to the right, you can see me carefully delaminate one of those larger fused bundles. I'm just rolling away one of the top layers. Now came the task of paper repair, and this included mending of tears, filling smaller losses, and strengthening those areas degraded by mold. This is typically done with Japanese tissue and wheat starch paste, a reversible technique. It was also the time to place and attach the countless loose pieces, and this seemed to be a never-ending process, but amazing discoveries were made. As Abigail and I became more familiar with the fragments, both large and small, over the course of the summer, the contours of the object finally emerged. Later, larger sections were soon connecting to one another, animal shapes started to fill in, and the names of wood engraver's printer and the menagerie's owner emerged. Perhaps most significant was the discovery of a 3x2-inch fragment embedded in one of those patties, as I call them, which turned out to be an edge piece from one of the two uppermost and most incomplete segments. And this was, in fact, the piece that initially established for us the height, the final height of the poster at 96 inches or 8 feet, when at some point we had thought it was maybe 12 feet. An exciting discovery. We also found that the overall losses were by far not as extensive as initially feared. To help locate the last and most vexing loose bits, we enlisted the help of a handful of colleagues one morning, those with the most discerning visual acuity. This proved to be immensely productive as well as good fun. So here's a before and after view of the poster. To the left, individual segments are not yet connecting, and the height of the poster is unknown. Losses were estimated at 50 to 60%. To the right is the object close to final repair. Large gaps have been filled and sections joined. There were a few occasions where I was tempted to follow Edward Gorey's example. However, overall, this has been an immensely satisfying and enjoyable project, one that also provided a terrific learning opportunity for my intern. And in fact, the second intern of last year also spent some time primarily helping with the paper repair. In this final slide, you see the poster digitally stitched together by AAS photographer Nate Fisk, allowing for the poster to be viewed in its entirety. Given the poster size, again, 6 by 8 feet, the 8 sections, each measuring roughly 2 by 3 feet, will have to be stored separately, as it is still a very delicate object, and we would otherwise have had to store it rolled up, and that definitely was not advisable. So since this box is covering up whom I'm thanking, I want to read that to you. Special thanks to Lauren Hewes, AAS photographer Nate Fisk, and my interns Abigail Slawick and Emma Hartman for their enthusiastic support. And this ends my presentation. I will see you later in the lab. And so over to Lauren Hewes now, Curator of Graphic Arts.
Thank you, Babette. All right. I just want to say also thank you to Kayla Hopper, who organized this close look at an AAS collections object. I've loved this. This is great. We have to do this again. Anyway, when AAS acquired the Howe and Company poster back in 2018, there was no way that I could have foreseen the path that we were going to go on and this result. Because when I first saw these shards of paper in the wooden trunk, all I could see were the type borders, and I could see the eye of the elephant looking up kind of through the shards. And both of those things were familiar to me. And I thought, oh, Jared Bell, this is another Jared Bell poster. So as cool as this object is, and with all of the great context that you got from Matt's talk, the reason we acquired this poster was because it was made by Jared Bell. Next slide, please. Because here at AAS, we have a focus on early American printing, and it turns out that we are the repository of record for oversized show printings made by Bell in the 1830s. AAS holds 3 complete posters by Bell and 2 fragments, the Howe being the star of the show today for the fragments. These are 2 examples of posters by Bell, one from 1831 and one from 1835, which were purchased by AAS back in the 1930s. Each one of them cost us $10 at the time. Next slide, please. The 3rd complete poster is the one that you've already saw, the Shelburne Museum version in Matt's talk. And just like Matt, I was like, no, we gotta get scale. We have to show scale. So I actually pulled out this poster this week and took it out into our reading room. And you can see half of it there laying on one of our actually 2 tables in our reading room. Because I feel like when you do these Zooms, you're looking at your screen and it's like 8 by 10 or something. And 111 inches isn't something that a lot of people can actually comprehend in their mind. So seeing it laid out with chairs and everything else does give you a sense of how amazing these posters were. This poster also came in the 1930s from the same estate as one of the earlier ones. These are great posters. They were this one was created by Bell for the Zoological Institute. He did a lot of work for them. And so as curator at AAS, I knew these 3 posters really well. I had actually brought them out for Matt when he came to do research at AAS on the American Circus. I've brought them out for other researchers. So when I saw the shards, that was how I was able to recognize Bell's work and to say, we got to bring this home because this is another example of his work from this very important period. Next slide, please. So who was Bell and why did he print these huge, giant, wonderful posters? Well, Bell began printing in New York City in the early 1820s, and he would have a 40-year career as a newspaper printer, a jobber, which meant that he would print any work for any customer, and a theatrical printer. Bell was also a controversial figure, often in court, constantly in and out of financial trouble, like many printers, and he apparently had a hot temper. Famously, he was the ringleader of a violent mob who ransacked the offices of the New York Herald in November of 1836. The Herald was a competitor of his own paper, The New Era. This event led to a series of lawsuits, a lot of back and forth in the papers between the printers, and it went on for a couple of years. What was the heart of the conflict? Theatrical printing. Both the Herald office and the New Era wanted to have those contracts with the menageries, the circuses, and the local theater companies because it was a very profitable part of their business. Next slide, please. In the 1830s, when Bell printed the Howe poster, his shop was a busy place. The 1830s, in fact, is perhaps the most interesting part of his long career. In the 20s, he was in the Bowery. He was printing mostly playbills and pamphlets for city booksellers. But in 1830, he became a printer publisher. He started his first serial, which was called Bell's Life in New York. Started a newspaper in 1833, a sporting magazine in 1834, and then in 1836, he started the Era. While he was doing all of that, he was also running the print shop and taking on orders for people like Howe and the Zoological Institute. He kept growing and growing his business. Can I have the next slide, please? The one constant in Bell's printing from the 20s to the 60s was his work in the entertainment industry. In the 30s, that included the big traveling shows, like the Menagerie. To create the images on the posters, Bell would hire wood engravers, people like Abel Bowen and Joseph Morse, who were based in New York. They didn't necessarily only work for Bell, they were freelancers. And they would create the eye-catching blocks, which he could then reuse on his posters. Sometimes they created original blocks too, like these two examples, which are from the Howe poster. And they are specifically described by Howe in his puffery, when he's describing the menagerie, particularly the omnibus, the bandwagon that you can sort of see. That was one of the parts of the poster that the conservation team really made come alive. And then the circus ring, which is a very early view of a ring used with a rope, because Howe wanted to promote the seating that he had available for people to come and see the menagerie. So there it is, cut specifically for this poster. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the yellowish image there. This is the other fragment that we have of a Bell poster in the collection. This was also donated to the Society in 2018 by one of our members, David Dorrit, and his wife, Linda Mitchell. So and actually, I'm just seeing the question that just popped into the chat, so try not to get distracted, but I'm about to answer that. So hang on. In February of 1835, Bell advertised in the paper that he had acquired a $4,000 Napier press, which was the latest technology by Robert Howe and Company. And he had brought it to his shop, and he was using that to print what he was calling mammoth sheets, examples such as the zoological poster, which you've seen already. In fact, in the imprint line on the zoological poster, he even puts, printed by Jared Bell and Street on his improved Napier press, the largest press in the world. So he's very clearly trying to crow about the fact that he has this amazing capability to attract other people to come to him to get these posters printed. It is a very short-lived moment, however. The fragment piece, I just wanted to make this point here. We think possibly was printed on the Napier, but we're missing that half. So we only have the half with his address because the events depicted on the poster are from 36 and 37, which is when the press was running in his shop. Next slide, please. So all of this success with the mammoth printing was very short-lived, but we have to admit, glorious. And fortunately, we have the remaining evidence. For Bell, as Matt mentioned, the economic crash in 1837 caused Bell to have to mortgage the contents of his shop. He was always on the edge anyway. So the question that came into the chat about the financial piece behind it, a lot of printers had a lot of money in equipment and staffing. And so they would try to turn that by having things like newspapers, steady work where they could take advertising and then use that money to keep the rest of the shop going. Jobbing work would come into, that was direct pay. So, you ordered 100 billheads and you got paid, and then that cash would also go back into the business. So because Bell got into trouble in 1837, just like pretty much every business in New York due to the financial crash, he took out he mortgaged the entire contents of his shop back to Howe and Company for $10,000 in March of 1837. Then he got a little clever. In January of 1838, his creditors came into the shop and he let them seize the Napier press. And then multiple legal cases ensued because Robert Howe was saying, hey, we have the mortgage on that. And then the creditors were saying, we don't care, we want our money back. And Bell just had to kind of watch everything unravel. It was a big mess, and it effectively ended Bell's mammoth poster production. However, he kept printing. These are examples of things that he printed after He lost the press in January of 38. He kept printing even after he went through a difficult divorce on infidelity, which was in all the papers. In 1847, he had a fire, which destroyed the contents of his shop, and he kept printing. In fact, he's printing up until age 72, which is when he dies in 1870. Next slide. Do I have another slide? One more slide, I think. Yeah. So adding the poster, the Howe poster, even in its only 80% state, has added so much information about what Bell was producing. This is before he has the Napier. He doesn't have the press yet to go really big, and yet he's still able to put together a really eye-catching poster. And I just wanted to end with this image of the tavern, which is where the poster was found, and to thank the dealer who had faith and brought it to me to ask if we would be interested in these fragments. The fact that this thing survived, it was inside the attic of this building on the little tiny window on the upper floor on the right, up in the eaves. And it came out and it went into the dealer's truck, and he brought it and showed it to me. And thankfully, the conservators did not have a complete meltdown when I brought it to them. So I'm so thrilled that we're able to introduce this poster to you and to see it done, and just to celebrate the fact that this amazing 1830s piece of paper is now once again as full as possible, as full as it can possibly be. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kayla, and I think we're going to go into discussion.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask Matt and Babette to also turn their audio and video back on. And thank you, all three of you, for giving us that wonderful complimentary presentations on this fantastic poster. And so now I'm going to encourage people, I just did in the chat too, but please do feel free to ask any questions you may have. We will answer those in just a few minutes. There's the dedicated Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can put them in there. So now we're just going to spend a few minutes hopefully having just a little bit of a discussion amongst you about kind of your different perspectives on this. And to get things started, we actually want to turn to Babette first, who is in the conservation lab with the poster spread out on the table. And Babette, I know there were a few things that you might want to point out when you can actually see the physical object.
Right. So in this beautiful new conservation lab, we've had ample space to work on such a large object. I think it was the biggest object, not I think, it's the biggest object I ever worked on in my 30-year career here at AAS. And so unfortunately, it's too wide for us to have turned it this way. So just imagine that this portion here is the upper half. So you have the four sections that represent the upper half, and then these four sections are the lower half. And you can see we have some edges down here. We have sometimes just 2 inches of edge on the left side. This area up here connects with the jaguar down here. So sometimes we had to decide whether we're going to put a fragment, attach it to this piece or to that piece. And up there you can also see, I think that was the 2-inch piece that I mentioned. That was definitely a straight edge. So with that, we knew that that was the upper edge of that, of the poster. And that gave us that height of 8 feet. But what I definitely do want to show you is all of the little remaining bits and pieces. So we're down to this kind of fragment, and we have carefully documented little bits that all say where they were found, what they were potentially attached to, stacks and stacks of them. And of course, there's no way that we can attach these, but we're going to save them. The larger pieces I have put into a binder, and these are all sections that nobody was able to place, even after our puzzle day with our very capable colleagues. So we spent an hour or two, and I think what happened is that they were stuck to a particular section from the time when they were folded, because they, the poster was folded this way and that way a couple of times, so they might have gotten stuck in an area, and the place that they actually came from may have been nibbled away by a mouse. So then there's no place to put these. So, but everything is going to be saved for a scholar. And as I said, these 8 sections, because we certainly don't want to roll a fragile object, even though it's stabilized, but it is still very fragile. And so the individual 8 sections are going to be put into a Mylar pocket, and that way they can be presented to a scholar. But we have the high resolution scans, and digitally it is going to be available through our website.
I just was going to say quickly while you're panning over it, the elephant there, Columbus, is interesting. It's the 3rd or 4th elephant imported into the United States, and there's two quick facts about it. One, we know what it was purchased for, $9,000. I forget if it's in Salem or Newburyport, but there's a contract on its arrival. So it was bought for $9,000 in 1817. Again, just showing how much money was involved in the business. But then also, it was one of the hardest working animals in show business. Columbus worked from 1817 to the 1850s. And unfortunately, he died in North Adams, Massachusetts, crossing the river. The bridge collapsed in the Hoosick River. And that was the end of poor Columbus. But, spent 35 years in the menagerie and circus business. And then there's one other quick thing I was going to say is that one of the other really interesting cuts here is of the leopard in the cage at the far end on the left. It's just the first image I know of an animal trainer in a cage with leopards. So there've been lion acts and tiger acts, but they specifically specifically advertised the leopard act.
Yeah, it's one of the things I found so amazing about this when we were researching this to try to date it. I mean, this is something Matt and I have gone back and forth on too. We were all hoping it was going to be on the Napier, like on the large press, but the exact matches that we found in the newspaper of Howe's descriptions of the show as it's moving matched the parts of the band. The people who are playing in the band are listed in the newspaper, and they match. There's the leopards.
There's
fabulous.
The leopard.
There he is. There's the leopards.
Wrong animal.
That's okay. It's a big cat in a cage. So the specificness of the poster matching the newspaper, and then the fact that this poster was found on the route of that summer, it really all sort of comes together for that pre-1835 date, which is amazing. It's still every time I look at this, I get a little shiver because I remember what it looked like in the box. It's like, there it is, done.
Exactly.
So one of the things I was concerned with when we were first starting to look at this, Babette, was the quality of the paper. Can you say something about what paper was like in 1835? Do you have a sense of this, particularly this paper? Because I know you've done some analysis on it.
Right. So we were curious about the composition of the paper because it would have normally have been rag fiber, which would have been a mix of cotton and flax. But we were a bit surprised that some of the really strong creases did not relax during the wet treatment. And normally with cotton, they would just flatten out. And so we splurged and sent a fiber sample off for analysis, and it came back as 99.4% bast. So that's linen fiber, and then just 0.6% 0.6% cotton. So this was probably a very expensive specialty paper that was purchased for the poster, knowing that it was going to be exposed to the elements. In itself, it's heavy, so it had to stay up there on the wall and not tear at the little tacks. Actually, I can show you some of these little tacks if Nate would like to zoom in. There's, for instance, one, and here's another one. So here's one, there's one, there's also another one. Yeah, so that explained it for us, that this was an expensive paper that Bell invested in.
So this makes me want to do that analysis on the other 3 that we have and see where on earth was he getting high quality, big sheets of sort of flax-based paper. That means I have to start thinking about paper mills differently. So it adds, what's so great about this kind of program is, the curatorial piece, the historian piece, Matt, you kind of fill both shoes there. But then the conservator piece, we can get ourselves all worked up trying to answer questions, but then we always have more questions, which for me, I want to know now, what were Bell's relationships with paper makers?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in for a second, just because this is a really good segue into some of the questions that are in the Q&A. So there's multiple questions about paper, actually.
Okay.
So, there were a couple of people are asking if it's multiple sheets of paper that are then assembled together, and if that's the case, how are they assembled together, or are the paper sheets this big?
Go ahead, Babette.
Yeah, so in that last slide, and I should have counted, maybe Lauren remembers, I think there may be 10 sheets.
It's 10 sheets. Yeah, I think this is a 10 sheet.
Sheets.
Yeah.
Right. And so normally, you might imagine that the paperer is out there on his horse and with a bucket of some kind of adhesive. However, in this case, we found no adhesive residue on the back of the sheets of paper, and because we had to separate the long horizontal strip just in this 2-inch section that was still intact. It was clear that it was hide glue, animal glue, and that is an adhesive. I don't know if any of you have worked with it. It has to be warm. It was also called warm glue when it's applied. Otherwise, it's like Jello. So that proved to us that the entire poster would have been assembled at the print shop ahead of time, rolled up somehow, and then just simply tacked on. And that's, as I said, that's what saved it, because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to remove it from the building structure.
Yeah, it would have been just papered over, which was pretty typical of the paste method. You would just paste, the next show would go over the top.
Right.
And someone in the Q&A is asking that, saying, Susan Nance is asking, would it be safe to say that in the 1830s, some very kind person carefully untacked this poster from the side of the building and saved it?
Yeah, so I think some very kind person in Maine rescued of our posters. One of these fragments and 2 of our posters were rescued and were owned by people in Maine. Whether they were saving them because they're so fabulous or because they wanted to use the paper, I don't know. This one ended up in an attic. The other 2 were in a collection and then were purchased, as I said, in the 1930s by AAS. Matt, have you seen anything in your travels of a poster that's been removed, that's been pasted?
No, I don't think they come apart that easy. So like anything, the only other examples I can think of are, there was that big project that Shelburne Museum did when they found
much later.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone would have pasted over this board just because there weren't that many traveling entertainments in 1835,
right.
Like that's very typical of the later 19th century. You just put your advertising up over another person's. But at this point in where are we? Like Benton, Maine.
Yeah.
I don't imagine there was a huge amount of advertising going up. But
Right.
you know, again, I could be wrong, but that would be my impression, is that someone probably took it down
And
at some
saved it.
point to save
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's with our other two as well. I have to go back and look and see if they have tack holes. This poster has made me think differently about the others that we have.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm gonna
keep us on time.
Start kind of firing away on those. So one is a question about value, but this question is also about conservation. So, you know, there is the question of how much the poster is worth, which, as you know, we always have a hard time answering those kinds of questions. But also, do things usually gain or lose value after conservation?
In this case, this one gained value after conservation because you couldn't even look at it before conservation. Babette, do you want to address that more broadly about conservation and value in historic paper?
Sure. I mean, in this case, we know it's the only known copy, right? And the way it was in the trunk, you couldn't have viewed it safely. It really took weeks and weeks of unfolding, piecing things together. So it was an absolutely necessary time investment in order to make the information accessible. So while it's still rather incomplete, there is very important content, like the first depiction, or we believe to be the first depiction of a circus ring. So that was not clearly visible when it was still in the trunk. Although I think, Matt, you peeked at it and you saw.
You got a preview. You got a preview
Right.
from my phone.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I will just say about that chunk. I mean, it's definitely a ring.
Yeah.
But given that it's a dandy jack, like a circus ring they're all standard size, diameter 43 feet, and that to me doesn't appear to be a 43-foot ring because there's a guy standing in it and a pony and a monkey. So it's likely that it was just a smaller ring. And again, that doesn't make it any. I know we're getting into technicalities here, but this is what life is, right? So I wouldn't say it's a full size, a regular quote unquote circus ring, but you know, it does provide a view of what another circus ring might have looked like, which is, you know, seating that has a roped off ring and with portable seating constructed behind it. Again, part of the logistics and genius of the American circus was figuring out how to get as many people into a show and have a good sight line as possible. And so there's all these clever ways that showmen spend time figuring out how to, you know, build tents, put up seating, and then put it all away that same day and set it up somewhere else the next day. So, you know, I'll definitely be taking a closer look at it. And I'm sure a lot of the circus history people in this will as well.
So, Brown has a question about that this appears to be a tour de force of restoration. I think of the Dead Sea Scrolls. How remarkable was this restoration for an American piece?
There's always such good work going on. Babette, what do you think?
Well, I think this particular piece was not as much of a challenge in terms of scientific analysis and or complex treatments. They were just time consuming because of the extent of the damage. And all of this, you know, was this giant puzzle. I'm sure we spent weeks doing the paper repair. Just even washing each item took long. So it was labor intensive. It wasn't so much of a conservation challenge. It was kind of clear what we were going to have to do. And we knew that it was going to take a lot of time. And so that was something, as I pointed out at the very beginning, we had frequent conversations with Lauren and would just look at it and say, is it worth it? And Lauren always said, absolutely. And so with the help of...
I think what I said was go find me another one. That's what I would say. You know, it's a unique object, and the information that's on it is is therefore, valued.
Yeah, and I would just say too on that front, I mean, one of the things I love about these posters is just that each individual cut is kind of its own work of art, right? These were cut by mostly different people. I mean, sure, some of the guys men or women cut the same ones, but I mean, there's, as you say, the sign cuts by Bowen and Morris, et cetera. So we know, but some of the line work is just incredible, and some of it's very crude. But that's part of the wonderful thing of having a poster with 60 or so images on it.
Yeah, you can really get a sense of the work that's done on these. In fact, that one, the Morse one, is one that he reuses on the zoological poster. So we know he uses the emu / ostrich / I'm not sure what ray, kind of large flightless bird.
I forget. Where else are there? Do we have other names, Lauren? I don't even remember. I just Morse.
Well, Morse is on here, but there's some others too.
I'm just looking here. There's Morse once more on the emu, and then big. Yeah, we have Morse twice or 3 times.
Yeah, on the cages.
And I don't see.
Oh, that's good. That zooms right in. There he is on the. Yeah. Go ahead, Kayla.
Everyone's getting a really good shot right now of kind of how these pieces are held together with the tissue paper and stuff. I'm gonna turn to a question from Schiller. Is when we acquire vintage posters, we intentionally do not have them mounted onto linen backing, as to our mind it destroys the integrity of the poster and keeping it as original as possible. Instead, we try to put the poster inside a soft, transparent enclosure for safety and handling. What is the current opinion of museum conservators as how to best preserve the original?
Yeah, so I also, there's a big echo. I also try to do as little as possible, and the beauty of working for an institution such as CAS, we can always restrict access to the originals by digitizing or providing some other surrogate. So in this case, I initially actually thought I might line the entire poster and then also have maybe just 4 large sections. But it is a very wet process, and there were just so many fragments and so many weak areas that we thought we would just cause more damage. So basically, we just did extensive mending of tears, laying tissue underneath. So the answer is as little as possible, and to just stabilize the original object and not recreate anything that is no longer there.
So moving off of that, there's another question. We know we saw the composite that was done digitally to show what the whole picture would have been like together. And I want to give a shout out to Nate Fisk, our digital photographer and videographer, who is behind the camera right now. So Nate did that composite as well. And someone is asking if you could use computer animation to complete parts of the post where the language missing is clear enough from the language fragments that have been conserved. So could we digitally fill that in?
So we've talked about this. Now that the work is done, we're looking at that. I know I've talked with Nate about, he has a friend who does sort of restoration on photographically, obviously not conservation this way. And because we have the other Bell posters where we can look at those for font use and to see if there's a type that's been repeated. So we could be potentially able to fill in letters, border, that kind of thing. There are unfortunately several big areas on this poster where we don't have anything left. And that is the top piece that they're showing right now, the gap between the text at the top above lions and leopards, that piece, where that connects to the bottom of the other one is our biggest hole. And that is where, unfortunately, where the information is on where the show was being held and all kinds of, good stuff. So that would be tricky, but we could definitely spell out menagerie, digitally and grab that back and be able to guess kind of where those letters would fall. So I think we could do some, but I don't think it would take us all the way to the finish line.
Another question from Diane Roman, who's asking, across the posters, do you see reprinting of any of the images, as the bandwagon omnibus for any animal? Also, such a cool project, and so excited to see it, even if only on Zoom.
So yeah, I don't know if Matt, if you're still wrestling a toddler, but
oh no, I'm fine.
Okay, all right. So do you want to talk about repeat use across posters in terms of the cuts of specific animals?
Well, it's hard. We don't really know. Blocks could obviously be stereotyped at the time.
Yeah.
You do see the other, there's just a few of these big oversized ones, one printed by Condon in Hartford that's at the New Bedford Whaling Museum that has has the Bowen cut on it as well. So Abel Bowen was either freelancing for Condon and Bell, or somehow these blocks were circulating. It's possible that the show bought the blocks and just took them to printers and got the posters printed locally, as you say, by like job printers. So I have like an index of these where I try to keep track of ones I know I've seen before that I've kind of stopped doing for a while. But at any rate, I was trying to track this for a while, but they didn't cut new images. They tried to copy ones, or they tried to stereotype the blocks, or I don't know how they did it, honestly. That's a great question. And I would love to talk to someone that knows more about printing to see how cuts circulated specifically.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's where the money is in these posters. The paper is one, but those cuts, and it wouldn't surprise me if the show organizers like Howe would definitely commission specific cuts of things that they definitely wanted to feature on these. And then the rest would be filled in, the borders or the bird cuts. I think there's a tree with birds in it that repeats on the Howe poster as well as on the zoological poster a year later. So some of them stayed in the shop and could be used, but I think others were definitely insisted upon by the show promoter.
We're just about at time. There is a lot going on in the Q&A, and a lot of it actually is people also just making comments and sharing information, things like that. So I can do that with all of you afterwards so that you can see what was going on. And so I'm just another question or two before we finish up. One is a little broader about circus printing at this time. How much was being done in New York between 1790 and the 1850s? Any sense of what portion of the business Bell had versus showmen who were traveling with printing capacity or hooking up with local job?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good question. A lot of printing happening in New York. A lot of it happening in the Bowery. Show printing is also happening in Boston, in Philly. It's not a one city kind of thing, but the traveling question is a good one. How much were they heading out in this period? Certainly it's very different from the 1790s to the 1850s. I mean, that's completely two really different approaches to creating these big posters, and then it gets even more amazing and complicated as you get into lithography, the big posters of the latter part of the century. I think we don't know the answer to all those questions well enough, and there isn't going to be one answer that fits all of them because the different shows are going to have different capabilities. I'm sure there were shows that didn't do show paper at all. Bell relied on it his entire career, and he would never give those up. I mean, he continued to print for theaters, for traveling shows. He gave up mammoth printing, that the big size pieces that he stopped doing after the crash in 37 and when he lost the press in 38. But he kept printing because it's like the government. Those are the two big things that a printer wants, right? They want a government contract and they want theatrical because the show changes every week. That means you need a new playbill. There's steady work. So that isn't really a good. Go ahead, Matt, please.
Just to follow up quickly, because I know we're reaching out of time. I would just say that it's less clear in the early part of the century, obviously, but later in the century, almost all the show printing's done out of New York. And again, there's Strobridge and Cincinnati, work, et cetera. But I mean, at the same time, there's situations in this era where printers end up owning circuses because circuses have to spend so much money on advertising that when they go out of business, the printer is who they're in debt to. And, printers are effectively in show business. So there's just a very symbiotic relationship is what I'm trying to say between
Absolutely.
printers and popular entertainment. A great example of that is Daniel Bowen, who's in Boston, who is both a printer and owns a museum. And so there's just all these intimate links between these two fields that are, I think well understood, but things like this help illuminate those kinds of relationships.
I'm going to leave it with one final question that if you can answer in 30 seconds or less.
No pressure.
And I'm going to wrap it up. What is the hope that a future scholar may discover for this amazing piece that you have not already uncovered? So just thinking about the scholarly value of this and how that fits into the bigger picture.
Oh, so the question is, I just saw you were breaking up a little bit. The question is the scholarly use of this in the future?
Yeah, what might a future scholar discover and through using this?
Okay, so Matt, would this have been helpful for you to have when you were doing your research on American circuses?
Indeed.
So I think we know there's lots of different ways in here. Certainly there's a printing history piece that I think, having another example of a large format printed work gives a person who's doing research on early printing from the 30s more information. It's just another piece of information. Then there's the content on there, as Matt was saying, but the animals that were being shown, about the promotional language that's being used by Howe and Co. So there's content that's specifically related to the object. And then there's this bigger piece, which is the consumer of these images, the consumer of these posters. This poster, was in an area outside of Waterville, Maine, in an area in the 1830s that obviously maybe there weren't many llamas walking around, or zebras walking around. What is the impact that something like this has on the consumer, the people who are standing around that ring, the ladies and the gentlemen who are there, who are going to attend the show? That's something that we don't have a lot of information about, but now we know where to look. So we can look in diaries from Waterville, Maine from the 1830s and see if anybody went to see the show. We can look in correspondence and see what kinds of things maybe struck them, even if they only saw the poster. I mean, the quote that Matt used in his presentation in the beginning about seeing it laid out in pieces because it was too big to hang up, was enough for someone to have an interaction with the pictures alone are almost as good as the real thing. Although the showman would want to make sure that you bought a ticket and came and saw the real thing. What do you think, Matt? What are the kinds of value that are waiting to be tapped here?
I mean, it's sort of limitless. We don't know what people are going to make of it, obviously, in the future. There's things that I think about, and there's things you think about, and there's things scholars we don't even know think about. So, I mean, to me, it's like it's globalization in a poster, right? The idea that Waterville, Maine has this, the amount of capital and relationships involved to get these animals into this spot with this poster is pretty incredible. And so untangling those networks to me is fascinating. And then I just point to colleagues I have like Brett Mazel and Janet Davis to think about people's
animal
relationships
studies
with animals and how it changes in this period. And so again, but I mean, those are some productive angles, but I'm sure there's many, many more. So again, maybe I can wrap up by just saying thanks to you all for the work you did to conserve it. And, we'll just have to see what people make of it. I hope we can have a symposium in 5 or 10 years.
Great idea.
Wonderful.
Well, I want to go ahead with that.
I just found another
dancing.
engraver.
Yeah, that's dancing.
On that hyena. That's everyone's favorite.
Yeah. with the look.
Thank you, everyone, for all three of you for joining us today and for giving this presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us in the audience. Amanda is putting some items into the chat about future programs. Please keep an eye on our other webinars and our virtual programs. You can go to the website to find out more about that. We'll also be putting a link to an evaluation in the chat, and it will come up after we leave the program. And we ask that you let us know if you like this or how we can improve it in case we want to do more of these. We always like to hear your feedback. So thank you, everyone, so much. And we can't wait to see you at the next one.